Welcome to ancient Egypt, a land of pharaohs and pyramids. Let's go back in time, way back, thousands of years ago. Imagine a place where the sun blazes, baking the sand until it's hot as an oven. This is the land of the ancient Egyptians, a place full of mystery and wonder. The ancient Egyptians built mighty pyramids towering over the land. Can you imagine pulling giant stones across the desert? They wrote in hieroglyphics, a language of pictures and symbols. They even worshipped cats. But how did this amazing civilization begin? How did it thrive in the middle of a hot, dry desert? The answer lies with a magical river, a river that brought life to the desert, the Nile River. The Nile River was the lifeline of ancient Egypt, a source of life in the arid desert. Flowing from faraway mountains, the Nile sliced through the desert, bringing water to the thirsty land. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been just a vast, empty desert. Each year, the Nile would flood, rising high above its banks. Don't worry, the Egyptians knew exactly when the floods would come. They planned their lives around it. These floods weren't scary, they were a blessing. The floodwaters carried a precious, gift-rich black soil. This fertile soil, called silt, was like magic. It transformed the dry land into lush fields, perfect for growing food. This incredible river, the Nile, was much more than just water. It was the heart of ancient Egypt, the reason why this mighty civilization could exist at all. Let's travel back in time and discover the magic of the Nile. Imagine you're a tiny drop of water, way down south in a land of mountains and mist. You're about to begin an incredible journey on the mighty Nile River. As you journey north, the land changes. The green valleys give way to golden sand, but you're not afraid because you're the Nile, and you bring life to the desert. Finally, after traveling for thousands of miles, you reach the vast blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River is one of the longest in the world. It flows for over 4,000 miles, like walking across the United States. Unlike most rivers, the Nile flows from south to north. The Nile is formed by the White Nile and the Blue Nile. Together, they create the mighty Nile, sustaining life for thousands of years. For centuries, the source of the Nile River was a mystery. Explorers dreamed of discovering where this mighty river began. Could it be a magical spring? A hidden lake in the mountains? The ancient Egyptians believed the Nile flowed from a sacred lake, guarded by a god with the head of a crocodile. In the late 1800s, explorers discovered the White Nile originates in Lake Victoria, East Africa. Today, we know the Nile is fed by rain and melting snow from Central Africa's mountains. Just like you have seasons, ancient Egypt had its own special rhythm, all thanks to the Nile and the sun. The Nile flows from a land of rain to a land of sunshine. Up south, the sun beats down, leading to heavy rains. It's like a giant water party. The rain swells the Nile, making it grow bigger and stronger. The Egyptians call this time Shemu, the season of harvest. The ancient Egyptians learned to live with this rhythm. Imagine the land of Egypt like a giant sponge drying out under the scorching sun. The Nile River, now slimmer, flows gently through the land. This is Pare, a time for planting seeds in the moist soil near the river. But don't worry, change is coming. Remember those heavy rains in the south? Well, all that water needs to go somewhere. It surges down the Nile, making it rise higher and higher. Finally, in late summer, the Nile bursts its banks, spilling out over the land like a giant bathtub overflowing. This, my friends, is the famous flood of the Nile. Don't be scared, though. The Egyptians welcomed the flood. They knew it was the key to their survival. They called this time Akhet, the season of inundation. It was like the land was taking a big, refreshing bath. The floodwaters spread out over the land, carrying with them the most wonderful gift, a rich black mud called silt. This silt was like magic fertilizer, making the land around the Nile super fertile. Imagine the land of Egypt like a giant coloring book. Right now, it's mostly colored in shades of brown and yellow, the colors of the desert. But when the Nile floods, it's like someone takes a giant green crayon and colors along the riverbanks. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, which means black land, because of this rich, dark soil left behind after the flood. It was like a gift from the river, a reward for waiting out the hot summer months. This black land was perfect for growing all sorts of yummy food. The Egyptians grew wheat to make bread, barley for their beer, and flax to make linen clothes. Can you imagine? A land that was once dry and dusty, now bursting with life, all thanks to the magic of the Nile. This abundance of food meant the Egyptians could settle down in one place, build homes and villages, and create their incredible civilization. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the lifeblood of ancient Egypt, the reason for its existence. Remember how the ancient Egyptians knew when the flood was coming? It wasn't magic, although it might seem like it. They had a secret weapon: observation. The Egyptians paid close attention to the world around them, especially the stars. They noticed that right before the flood, a special star called Sirius would appear in the sky just before sunrise. Think of it like Sirius coming to tell them, "Get ready, the flood is coming." They used this knowledge to create something amazing, a calendar. The Egyptian calendar was divided into 3 seasons based on the Nile's flood cycle: Akhet, flooding; Pere, planting; and Shemu, harvesting. This calendar helped the Egyptians know exactly when to plant their crops to take advantage of the fertile soil left by the flood. It was like having a giant timetable from nature itself. Talk about being in tune with the environment. Now, you might think a flood is a scary thing, right? But for the Egyptians, it was a cause for celebration. They knew the floodwaters brought life to their land, like a giant gift from the river gods. Imagine, after months of dry heat, the ground finally getting a good soaking. The water would rise slowly and gently, not a raging torrent sweeping everything away. The Egyptians even had a special god of the Nile called Hapi. They believed Hapi controlled the flood, bringing them the precious gift of fertile silt. When the floodwaters receded, the land was like a blank canvas, ready for the Egyptians to plant their crops. It was a time for renewal, a fresh start. The flood wasn't something to fear, but something to welcome with open arms. The Egyptians were clever folks. They didn't just rely on the stars and the calendar. They also became masters at reading the river itself. They knew that the height of the flood was important. If the flood was too low, it wouldn't bring enough silt to fertilize the land, leading to less food. But if the flood was too high, it could flood their homes and villages, causing damage. To measure the water level, they used special structures called nilometers. These were like giant rulers placed inside wells connected to the Nile. By checking the nilometer, the Egyptians could tell how high the flood would be and make plans accordingly. It was like having a giant water gauge. It helped them prepare for the flood and ensure they had a bountiful harvest. The Nile's flood didn't just bring fertile soil, it brought other cool things too. As the water rushed down from the mountains, it carried something else: fish. The flood season was a great time for fishing. Imagine the desert suddenly teeming with fish. The Egyptians would use nets and spears to catch the fish brought by the flood. This provided them with another source of food, adding variety to their diet. And guess what? The flood also helped with transportation. Remember how the Nile was like a giant highway for the Egyptians? Well, the flood made the river wider and deeper, making it even easier for their boats to travel. So the Nile's flood wasn't just about food. It was about using nature's gifts in all sorts of ways. The Egyptians were smart cookies, learning to live in harmony with the river and using its rhythms to their advantage. Imagine a time before cars, trains, or even horses pulling carts. That's what it was like in ancient Egypt. So how did people get around? You guessed it, the Nile River was their highway. The Nile flowed like a giant blue ribbon through the land, connecting north to south. People used boats to travel up and down the river, transporting goods, people, and even giant stones for building those amazing pyramids. Can you imagine the hustle and bustle along the riverbanks? Merchants selling their wares, families going on trips, and even pharaohs sailing by in their luxurious boats. The Nile wasn't just a mode of transport, it was a lifeline of communication. News traveled up and down the river, connecting different parts of Egypt. It was like their very own Facebook, but with boats instead of the internet. The ancient Egyptians were expert boat builders. They built different kinds of boats for different purposes, from small fishing boats to large sailing ships that could carry heavy cargo. They made their boats from wood, but also from something very special: papyrus reeds. These tall reeds grew abundantly along the Nile and were lightweight and buoyant, perfect for making boats. Imagine gliding down the Nile in a boat made of reeds, the wind billowing in your sails, the sun warming your skin. You might even spot a crocodile basking in the sun on the riverbank. Don't worry, they're usually harmless. Usually. These boat journeys could be long and challenging, especially going against the current. But the Egyptians were tough and resourceful, using their knowledge of the river and the wind to navigate their way. The Nile was more than just a highway. It was like a giant supermarket, playground, and source of life, all rolled into one. It was the heart of their daily lives. Every morning, Egyptians would go down to the river to collect water for drinking, cooking, and washing. They would also bathe in the river using a special kind of soap made from natron, a natural salt found in the desert. The Nile was also a source of fun and games. Children would splash and play in the shallow waters while adults relaxed by the riverbank, enjoying the cool breeze. The Nile was also their source of food. They would fish in the river, using nets, traps, and even spears to catch fish. They also hunted birds that lived along the riverbanks, adding to their diet. The ancient Egyptians understood that the Nile was precious and sacred. They respected the river and were grateful for its many gifts. It was a part of their culture, their beliefs, and their very way of life. Wow! We've learned so much about the Nile River and its incredible connection to ancient Egypt. It's like we traveled back in time and explored its banks with our own eyes, right? Without the Nile, there wouldn't have been an ancient Egypt. It was the lifeblood of this mighty civilization. The Nile was a source of life, food, transportation, and even fun. So next time you see a map of Egypt, appreciate the mighty Nile River, bringing life to the land. Even though ancient Egypt is long gone, its legacy lives on, and so does the mighty Nile. Just like thousands of years ago, the Nile continues to flow through Egypt, providing water for the people and the land. Today, people still farm along the banks of the Nile, growing crops just like the ancient Egyptians did. The river also provides a source of hydroelectric power, generating electricity for homes and businesses. And of course, people still sail on the Nile, but instead of papyrus reed boats, you'll find modern cruise ships. Tourists from all over the world come to experience the magic of the Nile, just like we did today, learning about the pharaohs, pyramids, and the river that made it all possible. So, even though we've come to the end of our journey through ancient Egypt, the story of the Nile River continues. It's a story about the power of nature, the ingenuity of humans, and the enduring legacy of a civilization that thrived because of a river.